So my husband told me that this room, that he never ever felt so much love as he felt in this room. So I'm like ready for you guys. And I have some people I love here too. So and I just want to say, before I start, I'm going to read this piece from the memoir that was published. This is a not yet sold memoir, although it's been excerpted in the New York Times and in Salon, and for some reason I can't get a publisher yet, so I'm hoping that will happen. But today is the anniversary. I have to say this because of the New York decision this week. It's the anniversary of the Stonewall riots in 1969. And you know, I've been thinking a lot about this gay marriage thing, and I'm a big supporter of gay marriage. The only people who I think get more shit about marriage than gay people are women like me who marry men in prison. I sort of wrote this because I sort of want to change this. Dennis is not the Dennis is number 3. Dennis is number 3. This was number 2. I brace myself whenever a man is convicted of a heinous crime and his photo gets plastered on TV for months, because I know it's only a matter of time before we begin to hear stories of those crazy ladies who write to them. I hate those stories, and not just because they're written with a tone that is both snide and misogynistic. I hate them because 19 years ago, I met a man who was in prison for murder, and I fell in love with him, and we were married for 7 years. So here's my sensational headline. She married a murderer. What I have found is that most of us who marry convicted men are not mad, and I've also found that most men in prison, even those guilty of the worst crimes, are not monsters. Our stories are complicated. Every true love story is. I met my husband when I was a newspaper columnist at Kingston, Ontario's newspaper, the Whig Standard, Canada's oldest daily, which had, until that very spring, been owned by just 2 families. Both were community-spirited literary types who did idiosyncratic things, like letting columnists like me write luxuriously long pieces. The Joyceville Medium Security Institution sat just off the road that I drove every day, and lit up by sodium lights, it looked to me like an alien spaceship. I had written columns about my trips to South Africa, to Israel, to Belfast, columns about date rape and drugs and youth in trouble, and prison seemed the obvious next subject. Driving there that first day, I could hear heaves rising up from the river as the ice broke up. But when I walked inside, I learned my first lesson about prison. There is no weather inside. It was always dank and musty with little light and less air. Prison administrators had arranged for me to meet 2 lifers, Rob and John, which taught me lesson number 2. Prisoners do not talk about their crimes. We talked about the food, passable, the guards, good and bad, the time, endless. They took me on a tour, showed me square cells the size of my bathroom, all concrete and steel, most of them double bunked since the population had expanded beyond the building's capacity. Over a lunch of greasy beef and fries, Rob mentioned that he ran the inmate committee, but his co-chairman had declared his lack of interest in meeting me. Instead of feeling snubbed, I felt cocky. Why wouldn't someone talk to me? I had quickly picked up the lingo, Sally Port and B&C and Unit 5, words that I hadn't known that morning slipping easily off my tongue by afternoon. Now I cringe at that memory, how badly I wanted to know the insider's secrets and how naive I was to think that I had figured them out. I was heading to the exit when I finally ran into the co-chairman Rob had talked about. His eyes invisible behind dark glasses, Will slowly looked me up and down with what felt like a stab of judgment. Tattoos snaked his muscular arms. His hair was military short and gray, though he always described it as being blonde, the color it was when he was arrested at the age of 31. His mother would tell me it had turned overnight, the same thing that happened to me when I turned 40, but that came a few months later. That day he was simply the only person who greeted me as if I were an enemy. I don't talk to journalists, he said. Nice to meet you too, I shot back, and I offered my hand. I'm a columnist, not a journalist, and there's a difference. He seemed like someone who could smell fear, so I tried to tamp mine down. How do you expect people to know what happens inside if you don't talk to outsiders? I said to him. He smiled. What do you care? If I could have seen his eyes that day, I'd have seen the good-humored tease that he could be, but those glasses were opaque. You want to know about what goes on inside, he said, talk to the families. They never hurt a soul, and they know what prison's all about. There's a family social on Saturday. You should come to that. Deal, I said. As I drove home, I felt buoyed. For years, I had seen lines of visitors streaming out of Joyceville's roadway. On cold and rainy days, I had even thought about stopping to pick up one of the women by the roadside, waiting for the bus into Kingston, 10 miles away. They always looked sad. But as my foot edged toward the brakes, I would think, she's probably smoking drugs or guns. The prisons had become the punchlines in our town, where much of the population earned their living as guards, administrators, contractors. It's amazing to me what I believed back then, that rapes and murders were daily and acceptable fare, that people in prison had little or nothing in common with me. But I did want to learn. I'd always been a sucker for the powerless. I grew up rooting for the Cleveland Indians, forever sided with my most awkward students, no offense to any of you over here. And on the sheep farm where I lived, I fell hardest for the weakest lambs and craziest horses. My father had been a prisoner of war in World War II, my grandfather a POW in World War I, and I understood that prison could cause harm not only to those who inhabit and work behind its walls, but also to those who inherit its scars. That's why his suggestion to talk to families struck me as wise. 2 days later, on a sunny Saturday, I returned to Joyceville. I talked to lifers and short-timers, to kids and moms and dads. I scribbled notes, and the day passed in a blur of sad stories and invitations to return. The gym was festooned with balloons like a school carnival where the women wore sexy dresses. In the far corner, I spotted a pretty woman and a bunch of kids surrounding Will, and I was surprised to discover what I felt in that moment, disappointment that he was married. On Monday, I was at the paper and a call came for me. I was in the middle of being filmed for a segment on an Ottawa television show. I never did find out how Will managed to make that call, but I promised I would phone him back. A few hours later, when I tried, I learned another lesson, lesson number 3. No one can call a prisoner, not even a reporter. Fearful that I had somehow upset him, I pulled some strings and finally was able to reach him. He wanted to know why I hadn't shown up at the social. I was there, I said. I saw you in the gym with your wife. Ex-wife, he said. Will told me he wanted to read the column I was writing, and I thought, is he flirting with me? And then I thought, wait, am I flirting back? I showed up the next day with the column and waited in the bleak visiting room for him. In one corner, a large television played too softly to hear, but loud enough to fill the room with static. In another corner stood 5 vending machines with chips and stale sandwiches and watery coffee. A fog of smoke filled the room, and a door led to the outdoor visiting area with picnic tables and a rusting swing set that I could hear creaking every time the door opened. After 10 minutes, Will swaggered toward me, confident and unsmiling. With his glasses off, I could finally get a look at his face. If I had wanted to cast a handsome convict hero, I would have cast him. Broader than Ed Harris, but with that gritty beauty, that gentleness that could turn hard. He nodded hello and sat down across from me. And as he read the column, I studied the red stars tattooed on his wrists and the word that wound up his muscular arm, desperado, laughably tough. One of his arms looked thinner than the other, and later I learned he had busted a bicep years before while attempting to lift a car barehanded. He was that kind of macho, and he called that a stunt he wished he could forget. Just me being an idiot, he said, and that was the phrase he used so often that ended conversations. He didn't like to remember the days that had led him to prison. He had been a drug dealer who killed another drug dealer, but I didn't know any of that yet. As he beamed in on the pages I had written, I marveled at his stillness. Finally, he looked up, folded the pages in half, and cleared his throat. "You're okay," he said, and his acceptance was a welcome relief. But he wanted me to get one thing straight and fast, that John, the prisoner who had been assigned to be my source, was NG, no good. He translated. He's a rat. It was the rats, he explained, who told the man whatever the man wanted to hear. Rats were allowed to start fights, take drugs, get drunk, all without risking bad reports or sudden transfers. All a prisoner had to do, Will said,